This video was made possible with the support of our Patreon members. Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to the Psychology Is podcast. I am Nick Fortino, and today our guest on the episode is Julia Hotz. Julia is a journalist based in New York who recently took an epic journey around the world to investigate the effects of what we're calling social prescriptions on mental and physical health. A social prescription, as you say in your book, is defined as a non-medical resource or activity that aims to improve a person's health and strengthen their community connections. Let me just ask so that we can hear your voice here right away before I go on with the introduction. How are you today, Julia?
I'm great, Nick. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm great too. As I mentioned when you first hopped on, very excited to talk about all of this with you. And I really think that, that in this podcast, as our longtime listeners are well aware, we have paid special attention to the problems with modern mental health care, the shortcomings, the over-reliance on drug prescriptions, and the problems with some of the ways in which we think about emotional struggles. And yet we have not really come through with really good alternatives. We've done a great job, I think, of highlighting the problems, but not as great of a job at offering different solutions. Mm-hmm. And so I think this really kind of meets that need. So thank you for creating this amazing resource.
Well, thank you, and thank your community for, shining a light on all that needs solutions. So it works both ways for sure.
Good. I feel appreciated. And the amazing resource, by the way, that I'm talking about is the book that has, that's your epic journey created, ultimately resulted in The Connection Cure, the prescriptive power of movement, nature, art, service, and belonging.
That's right. And it's funny, you holding it up there, it really goes nicely with your tapestry in the background. Like I think we have the same pine trees or something.
Everything feels right about this. Well, let me read from the book here right off the bat. Just right from the prologue, you wrote, "A huge part of our health is determined by the environments in which we live. We'll get into the precise science, but for now, take my word for it. To survive, we need basic resources. The things you think about when you hear environment: clean air, trees, nutritious food, shelter, and money. And to thrive, we need sources of joy, meaning, and relationships in our environments too. Reasons to wake up in the morning, things that make us feel healthy, connections to what matters to us. Together, these sources of surviving and thriving are called our social determinants of health. We can have the most knowledgeable doctor and the most clinically advanced medicine, but without these kinds of connections, we can never be truly healthy." Mm-hmm. Isn't that true? So I'll say a little bit more by way of introduction. So as Julia will share with you in much more detail, toured the world to investigate the spread of social prescribing, both on an individual level and a systemic kind of scaled up level. And the success stories she finds bring a long known theory to life. If we can change our environment, we can change our health. By reconnecting to what matters to us, we can all start to feel better. I will say, you're a very skillful writer. It was very enjoyable to read this book. Great storyteller. You do a great job as a journalist. You're a great journalist. You do a great job reporting on the various bodies of literature that consistently show the tremendous benefits of these social prescriptions. You make a very convincing case that widespread adoption of this paradigm is realistic in all types of countries and healthcare systems. And what I love so much is that you also gift your readers with your own vulnerability. In part 3 of the book, you get very personal and honest. So there's no way that we could exhaust all of the insight in this book in just one conversation, which is why I highly recommend that people get the book and read it. But I do want to try and touch on each of the 3 major parts in your book: the social prescribing for better health, social prescribing for better health care, and then the more personal section, social prescribing for you and me.
Thank you so much, Nick. That means so much coming from you. And yeah, like I said, I mean, even when I reread the book, it takes me a long time. So the fact that you were able to read it so quickly and have so, much to share and many questions to ask really means so much to me.
Good. It was time well spent for sure. Well, maybe just right off the bat here, just tell us about the genesis of this project. Did you think of it and propose it to somebody? Did a publisher propose it to you? Tell us, how did this all begin?
Totally. So there's like the professional answer and the personal answer. So I'll try to give you both. So the professional answer is that I'm a journalist, and I actually am a solutions journalist. So that means I try to report rigorously on responses to some of today's most widely felt problems. And I work for a nonprofit that's trying to help other journalists do the same. It's called the Solutions Journalism Network. And, through my work with them and through my own sort of freelance reporting, it seemed like the same issues kept coming up, right? People are just simply not well, right? We have rates of depression and anxiety continuing to rise, rates of stress, ADHD diagnoses have like tripled recently. And so have prescriptions, right? Prescriptions to treat those ailments. And, as your former guest, Robert Whitaker, makes plain, like, you would think that if we've invested so much research and development into psychiatric medication, into those sort of pharmaceutical responses, which tend to be like the clinical de facto response to things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, chronic pain, you'd think we'd be getting well, but we're not, right? We're getting sicker. And the pandemic, I think, really revealed that in a big way. And so I was curious about, what is actually working to systemically address what might be some of the root causes for some of these illnesses sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's how I came across social prescribing. I came across it as, an institutional response in the UK, firstly to problems of loneliness, which we can talk about in a bit, but then also really also to stress, anxiety, depression, chronic pain as well. And the personal answer is, I started to feel some symptoms of some of these ailments in my own life after the pandemic, during and after the pandemic, right? And it kind of made me think, well, who wouldn't feel stressed when, the pandemic introduced so much uncertainty? Who wouldn't feel anxious? Who wouldn't feel depressed if they were cut off from their sources of meaning, their work and their sources of joy and their relationships? All of us sort of had to contend with what it's like to be socially isolated. And from that personal element too, I thought about, wow, I'm pretty fortunate in that once the pandemic subsided, I was able to resume, some of those sources of joy and meaning and relationships in my environment. But not fully. And I think a lot of people felt the same way. It's why words like languishing kind of started to trend after the pandemic. It's, I think, part of the reason why, we saw these increases in symptoms. And so, yeah, both of those things were compelling me to really investigate, okay, well, if our environment is the problem, maybe our environment is the solution. And Social prescribing sort of operates on that philosophy that, as you just read from the intro, just as social determinants can affect our health for the worse if we don't have them, they can also affect our health for the better.
Beautiful. And then, I've read the book, so I'm kind of well aware of what this journey entailed for you, but describe for our audience, what exactly went into writing this book?
Yeah. So writing a book, everyone advised me, if you want to write a book, you have to really, really care about the subject. You have to be jazzed to, get up every day and work on it. And for me, I also had, my other job at Solutions Journalism Network while I was writing this book. So the process was first pitching it and pitching a book much like I'd pitch my solutions-focused articles on social prescribing, kind of like setting us up for the stakes and the evidence that already exists on this and, showing that I think the world is really hungry for better solutions to these widely felt problems. So fortunately, I have this amazing agent who helped me do that. And we were very fortunate to get a deal with Simon & Schuster, who, this part is funny. They said, yeah, okay, write this book. It doesn't seem like anyone else has really written about this. Give us a draft in fall 2025. And I said, fall 2025? That would have been 3 years from when I got the deal, which was in fall 2022. And I said, this is a hot topic. Someone else is going to write a book before then. And let's do it faster. Let's actually do it much faster. And so, sure enough, that's been true. Like ever since I had to turn in a draft for this book in fall 2023, so 2 years ahead of schedule, it has been just blowing up in the media. The state of Massachusetts just invested in a massive social prescribing pilot. At the international conference this year, there's reports that it's spread now to 32 countries. So, it was a hustle to get that reporting done. I kind of dropped my life a little bit. I left my apartment in New York and kind of set off on the road for 6 months to visit all those countries that you mentioned and tell these stories.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you felt that sense of urgency. I think you were right to feel that there is an urgent need, for this book. So I'm glad it's here well ahead of schedule. Grateful to Simon & Schuster for sending me a copy. So maybe what we can do is kind of focus in on part one of your book, basically, where you look at these 5 primary social prescriptions, which again are movement, nature, service, art, belonging. And I know, of course, you tell many people's stories. You talk about many different programs and organizations and communities. And so we maybe can just pick a few just to give our audience a taste of what you talk about. And so my question to you now is, if we let me back up a little bit and say this. I think it's important to point out here at the outset that, as you point out too, some people hear stuff like this and don't take it seriously because they think, well, that can't really be the solution to my depression. This is a chemical imbalance going on. What do you mean just serve? And then also, I think another possible reaction is, yeah, I know. A quick dismissive, think you already know this stuff. But I would argue this: to know but not do is to not really know. If you think you know that movement would alleviate your anxiety, but you're not actually doing it, you don't really know. Because if you really knew, you would do it. And so perhaps we can all kind of keep that in mind, because I think there's a lot of things we think we know, but we don't know experientially. We don't know to the degree that would cause us to change our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important to kind of keep in mind, because it sounds simple. Of course, movement, nature, art, service, and belonging will solve a lot of problems. But if we're not doing it, perhaps we need a little bit more convincing and self-experimentation.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, let's talk about the power of movement. And maybe you can share a story or two from the people that you met for how healing movement can be.
Yeah, I think first of all, you're totally right. Like, those are two very reasonable reactions to social prescribing. You know, one is like, okay, no, you know, how could it be that my environment is part of the solution when all my life I've been told that I have a disorder and a chemical imbalance and that I need XYZ because I was born this way and I'm deficient in some way. You know, that, and I can't blame anyone for believing that, because that has been the dominant narrative, especially in the United States. And I definitely think, especially when it comes to movement, the second, you know, pushback is true. Like, it's impossible to go to the doctor, or it's really impossible to look up any sort of ailment and find that exercise is not something that's recommended. You know, of course, we know we should exercise more. It's why we have all these recommendations, you know, 30 minutes a day, or, you know, 150 minutes a week. And yeah, I know I should exercise more. We should all exercise more. But the problem that I learned is a couple of things. You know, number of one, all the access issues that come to exercising. You got to have a gym membership, maybe. You got to have equipment to do it. There's a big sort of mini history in that section about how exercising and moving our bodies used to be fun and free in a way we, you know, spend our time, until people realized, wait a minute, I can make money off of that. And so I'll take us to an example from the chapter of this truck driver named Frank, for whom that was the case. And, you know, Frank is this joyful, jolly guy, he's this loving grandfather. And yet for most of his life, he was depressed and lonely and a type 2 diabetic. And when he would go to the doctor would say, you know, gosh, Frank, you really got to eat better. You have to exercise more. And Frank would sort of like slink his head and slip out of the doctor's office, not wanting to come back there, sort of feeling ashamed. But what they didn't know is that, you know, Frank works 12 hours a day. He doesn't have time to hand prepare salads on the side of the road. You know, he's probably eating fast food. And if the doctors were serious about wanting him to exercise more, they had to do more than just wag their fingers, right? And it gets so bad that Frank's eventually told he's going to be on insulin for the rest of his life, that there's no way to reverse his type 2 diabetes, until he finally meets a doctor who flips the script. And instead of just focusing on what's the matter with Frank, you know, the fact that he's overweight and sedentary and a type 2 diabetic, he starts to wonder, okay, tell me about your childhood and something that you loved to do, or tell me, is there a sport you've always wanted to try but haven't had a chance to? In other words, he says, tell me about what matters to you instead of just what's the matter with you. And Frank had never had this experience at the doctors before. You know, he that part of him was never activated. But sure enough, he realizes, you know, I've always loved to bike, but I haven't ridden a bike in years. I don't own a bike. I don't know how I would get into that again. So that's when Ollie, his doctor, says, okay, Frank, well, I'm going to prescribe you a spot in a cycling course. It's going to, you know, work with your truck driver schedule. We're going to get you a bike. It's going to be Tuesdays at 10 a.m. and someone is going to teach you literally how to ride your bike again. And you're not going to be alone. You're going to be with people in your age group who are also learning how to ride a bike. And, the spoiler of that version of that story is that Frank loves it. He ends up, excelling in the course and then actually wanting to continue to ride his bike after, so much so that he starts his own biking group. He calls it the Chain Gang. Very cute. And, he loses the weight. He is able, believe it or not, to come off his insulin. And, now he goes around the country speaking at diabetes conferences saying, listen, it is possible for you to reverse this. You don't have to be on insulin. But, you have to have a sense of joy when you're exercising. You have to have people holding you accountable. That's a huge bit of the movement, right? Who's going to hold you accountable? And it has to be fun, right? And so that's Frank's story. But I would love, and that's pretty obvious, right? Like type 2 diabetes is associated with obesity. Obesity, we don't hear that word without thinking about exercise and physical activity. But I think what was more surprising to me is the story about a movement prescription helping someone with their clinical depression. So is it okay if I just quickly recap that one?
Please,
okay.
Yes.
And I mean, this is another case of, somebody who, this wonderful, passionate researcher named Amanda who, when I meet her, she's as joyful as can be. She's on the beach, which we later learn is her happy place, but had a lot of terrible events happen to her in a short period of time. She lost her husband, she lost her mother. She found out her husband was having an affair, so she divorced him. She lost her job. She had to move to a place where she didn't know anybody. And this was all during COVID itself. So she had 5 major losses in her life. And at least in the earliest conceptions of what depression is, it was very much related to the loss of connections in an environment.
I remember you quoted Charles Darwin as saying that it was the loss of life-sustaining connections. And I hadn't heard it put like that, but I love that description.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up because, Charles Darwin, we know him, of course, for his groundbreaking work on evolution. And what Darwin also sort of theorized is that actually depression is a very normal response to that loss of life-sustaining connections, right? It's a signal telling us to reconnect. And so for Amanda, I think that was certainly true. She needed to reconnect. Now, in the meantime, though, she was really miserable. I mean, suicidal. And so she's prescribed the maximum dose of SSRIs, antidepressants. But what Amanda is ultimately also prescribed, again, kind of like Frank, through a process of rediscovering her childhood curiosities and interests, is a prescription for sea swimming, cold, open water sea swimming, like in the winter. And this is great on a couple of levels. Number one, I think you've mentioned this research on your podcast before, that there's a ton of research demonstrating that exercise and movement can increase our serotonin. It can help us release endorphins. And not surprisingly, right? Because we evolved to move our bodies. In other words, it can release some of the same chemicals that Amanda's SSRIs do. But not only that, the virtue of this sea swimming prescription is that she's doing something difficult. She's, learning how to swim after a long time of not doing that. So she's stimulating her dopamine pathways. She is physiologically stimulated by this cold water and this beautiful environment, kind of reminding me again of your tapestry. And once again, she's doing this with other people. Hugely key. This 8-week sea swimming course where she is connecting with other, mostly women her age, who have also been through sort of disconnecting events. And I mean, the before and after on Amanda is pretty unbelievable. She tells me that before this course, she felt like her mind was in a helmet, right? And that she was constantly caught in these really deep, dark thoughts, and she didn't want to get out of bed or have motivation to do anything. But she says now that she's been through this course, and also like Frank with the cycling, she continues to meet up with her swimmers on a weekly basis. She says she has something that gets her out of bed in the morning. It helped her life become bright again. And that's not just anecdote, because Amanda has also gone from being on the maximum dose of antidepressants to the absolute minimum, which she describes as sort of just, a chemical, keeping her from relapsing too hard. Because as we know, withdrawal from SSRIs can be really brutal. But I just think that's amazing, and maybe some hopeful wisdom for the people who say, no, I have a chemical imbalance. I need these SSRIs and I need them in my dose forever. Actually, there are other ways that we can, stimulate the
Yes.
for those chemicals.
Amen. Exactly. So, yeah, I love Amanda's story, and I feel like it highlights a few things. Number one, of course, the main point that movement can be extremely therapeutic, particularly for things like depression. But one of the other things that it highlights for me is when people think of movement, kind of like you talk about, what gets drummed up in their mind is the idea of running on a treadmill in a gym or something like that. And what I would maybe say to people is, if the movement that you are trying to commit yourself to doing consistently, if you dread doing it, it's not the right type of movement. There are so many ways to move your body. This is like very near and dear to my heart. I mean, it's like part of my identity. I am athletic. I move. I love dancing. Literally last night I was dancing under the full moon, and it's a staple of my well-being. And it brings me so much joy. And honestly, yeah, exercising in a gym can bring me joy too, but certainly for many people, that's not it. And when they think of movement, they don't necessarily think of going out and swimming in the ocean, but it can totally be that. And so many of these social prescriptions can be married together. Like you can combine, of course, movement and nature by hiking in nature, for example. So again, the point is, if you dread whatever it is, whatever activity you're trying to commit to, then that's not the right one for you. And there for sure can be some form of movement that I think any individual can fall in love with. So amen to this.
Amen. I'm so glad you said that. And that just really reinforces the point about social prescribing. I should have said this at the outset. It's about shifting from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. And that's going to be so different for every person. And you're so right that, I think if we got to the deep down what matters to us, we probably wouldn't say running on a treadmill in a gym. I mean, maybe. but more likely than not, as you said, there are other elements like nature and like belonging with other people.
Yes.
And to this, I really, again, just look to the wisdom of kids. Like kids so intuitively move their bodies in a fun way.
Yes.
Kids are dancing all the time. They're always, running and inventing sports. And it's just weird to me that like we suddenly grow up and we think, oh, we can't do that anymore. That's for kids, or that's something we did in school or university even.
Right.
But why not? There should be more opportunities for that, I think.
Amen. And it's with kids, it's instinctual. And then somewhere along the way, so many of us get disconnected from those instincts.
Yeah.
But I think that's more than getting disconnected from the impulse to move. It's being disconnected from a very potent source of vitality. And you do a great job in the book too, pointing out that movement was just embedded in our lives. We didn't have to intend to move or make a point to move if you dial the clock back far enough. But now we do. Now in modern times, we have to be more conscious of it because there are many lifestyles that require almost no movement. So,
totally. And it's funny you say that because I think the opposite is also true. Like here where we are in the US, that's true. Like we have gyms on every corner. We have classes that help us get that, daily recommended movement. But, in cultures that actually live the longest, I talk a little bit about the blue zones research, and this researcher, Dan Buettner, discovered that the places where we live the longest on Earth, parts of the Mediterranean, Okinawa, Japan, a lot of that has to do with the way movement is just embedded in the daily lives of these people. And it's often tied also that movement is, to see your neighbors, it's to garden, it's to get, local groceries. It's a very mobile lifestyle as opposed to a sedentary lifestyle. And I think that's really interesting too.
Yeah. And maybe as another note on depression and the origins of depression, there are myriad factors that contribute to a depressive reaction to the experience of feeling depressed. And, you point out wisely that I want to compliment too the way you really got certain very important things right, like the origin of the chemical imbalance notion and how the phrase a reductionistic oversimplification of a very complex biological state, which I believe is quoted from the famous paper upon which the chemical imbalance theory is based. And then you also get right that the drugs that purport to correct the chemical imbalance came before the explanation that depression is caused by that.
Yeah.
And I remember this came up like when I was writing my dissertation, I was writing about that too. And it's very important to realize that. And in my opinion, it's important to realize the absurdity of that as well.
Totally.
And I would liken this as an analogy. If you could imagine that you had a bunch of people who lacked self-confidence, and let's say in some future version of the DSM that gets codified as a disorder, like deficient self-esteem disorder. And you have these people, and then they smoke methamphetamine, and they have this enormous surge of self-confidence. What has happened with explaining depression in terms of the chemical imbalance is the equivalent to us saying that the reason those people lacked self-confidence was because they lacked the dopamine surge that methamphetamine brought on.
Yes.
And that's just only a slightly exaggerated version of what happened.
Yeah.
So,
such a good analogy. That's so true. Like, that's a brilliant, and it sounds like we both had a similar sort of like jaw drop reaction when learning about this stuff. Because for me, did you also grow up in the United States?
I did.
Yeah. And, for me, and I think lots of folks who grew up in the United States, like, you learn about depression through commercials for antidepressants. Like, I remember being 8 years old, sitting on the couch, watching a sitcom and seeing a commercial for Zoloft and having it explained as a chemical imbalance and seeing the very visual thing, 8-year-old kids, we love visuals, as imbalance between nerve A and nerve B. Yeah. And sure enough, I replay that commercial 25 years later, and it says really quickly, the cause of depression is unknown. And it's like, whoa, what? You're saying that as you're showing me, the 8-year-old kid, like this very reasonable depiction of depression, which I understood my whole life. And, I love talking about this, and I love talking about it with someone who is also well-versed in the research, because I think that that has done a lot of damage. That quick explanation of depression as a chemical imbalance. And on one hand, I'm sympathetic to the way that, we definitely need to destigmatize a depressive reaction. The solution here is not to, it's much better, I think, to have what we're currently dealing with than just suck it up and don't, bottle it in, you're fine. Like, no, those symptoms are very real. But I think ironically explaining it as a chemical imbalance, as some way that you were born deficient in these chemicals, you have a disorder, is actually more disabling than saying you are having a reaction and you evolved to have a reaction to depressing events, and you're going through that, and it's really, really hard. And I'm that section was hard for me because I have a lot of friends who take SSRIs for whom it's helped them. I also have some for whom it's really damaged them. And for everything, there's nuance. I try not to be too prescriptive, but I think believing that SSRIs are, the only or even the first line solution to these symptoms is a problem that was created by this very persuasive chemical imbalance theory.
Well said.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah. And you succeeded in what you were trying to do there and not stigmatizing taking pills. And I try to do a good job of that too, as harshly as I criticize this practice. I'm primarily criticizing the misinformed consent that people give about it. Because, basically, I just think it's important to understand that by taking an SSRI, you're not addressing the root cause.
Right.
But most people do believe that they're addressing the root cause. And that's perhaps the crux of the issue for me. But if you frame it accurately, which is much more akin to using wine or cannabis to stabilize your mood or reduce your anxiety, if you frame it in that way, then we're more informed, then we can consent to it in a way that's actually informed.
I love that. And it brings to mind, this analogy that I've been using to describe like sort of the state of affairs and why we need social prescribing. And it's that I wrote about this in like a Slate op-ed, but imagine you have 10 people in a room, right? We love analogies here. I love your analogy, so I'm going to give you one to ponder too. Imagine you have 10 people in a room and 5 of them are sweating, right? And in America or in most parts of the world where, we see discomfort and we seek to treat, the symptom, the solution would be to give those people a pill that helps them to stop sweating, right? Your problem is that you're sweating. Take this pill, you'll stop sweating. Or if you're, an influencer, a wellness influencer, it might be, hey, buy this fan, you'll cool off, right? But nowhere is there like an easy, culturally sexy solution to say, maybe the room is too hot. Maybe if 5 people are sweating, we should think about lowering the temperature of the room. And I think those numbers really line up with the symptoms of mental distress in America right now. Like, people are sweating, people are unwell. And the most culturally, convenient solutions are to treat the symptom through a pharmaceutical solution or to sort of, buy some product that will help you, suffer less.
Right.
And I get it. We all just want to be comfortable in our one precious life, but there needs to be more attention to cooling the room down so that all of us, even those who are more prone to sweat, less prone to sweat, can feel better, right?
I don't know if I've said the word amen so many times in a single podcast, but yes, that's excellent. And what's interesting too is that those 5 people who are sweating first are kind of like the canaries in the coal mine. They are the ones who are a little more sensitive to these conditions and show symptoms of something not being right first. And that's very important. And I think that is, we have the canaries in the coal mine in society as well. The people who are becoming depressed first or anxious first, they're just maybe a little bit more sensitive to certain types of conditions, but they are foretelling what's to come for everybody if we don't cool the room down.
Wow. Can I amen that? I think that's so great. And that, I think, is the true destigmatizing, right? It's saying any of us can sweat at any time. You are not disordered. You are not deficient. You are not imbalanced. You are just at this moment in time having a reaction that you evolved to have. And anyone would have that same reaction if they were in your shoes. So I love that, them being the canaries in the coal mine.
Well, perhaps if I may make one more comment on depression, and then we can talk about nature. And I'm so intrigued by the idea of restoring attention by immersing ourselves in nature. So I want to get into that here in just a minute, but perhaps as one final comment on movement and depression. And many people I've learned, like in my role as a college professor, talking to many students over the years, that many people have this idea that there's something we could call situational depression and something we could call non-situational depression. And I understand where this distinction comes from. And as it sounds, situational depression is when, like Amanda's case, when you can point to very specific events that are depressing. And then non-situational depression is when you can't seem to pinpoint events or conditions in one's life that would explain the depression. And while those terms may be useful, I would make perhaps a bold statement that I don't think there is any such thing as non-situational depression ultimately, because there's no such thing as a person who is not in a situation. Sometimes there's just not as concrete, obvious, immediate conditions, but if you zoom out far enough, you'll see the conditions of the world. You'll see the conditions of your community and what is lacking, or at any scale. You can zoom out far enough, and you'll see something that will explain the depression. And I would say whichever one a person is experiencing, whether it's like Amanda and you just found out that your husband was cheating on you and your mom died, etc., or you're the person who's like, I just feel shitty every morning and I don't really know why. Either way, movement is going to be extremely powerful in helping you move through that depression. Because if it's something where you know exactly what needs to be processed, like the ending of a relationship, movement will help you process that. It will take the edge off of it. It will vitalize you. It will make it easier to process that. And then on the other case, when you just kind of feel the general malaise, then movement, again, it's vitalizing. It might actually be all that's necessary. So I would say in all kind of variants of depression, I think movement is extremely powerful.
I love that. That is so brilliant. And I really agree with you on the situational, non-situational. That's really going to stick with me. We're always in a situation, you know? And you're right. I mean, that I think is a huge selling point of social prescriptions, is that they're very unlikely to make things worse. And we know this because, like, people who do not have a diagnosable disorder, quote unquote, can still take a social prescription and be fine. And I think, you know, more often than not, it rarely is that a person just has one thing, one disorder. It's why we see, I mean, every single day I have like an incessant number of Google alerts for things like depression, anxiety, chronic pain, loneliness. It seems like every day I see a study demonstrating that these two factors are closely related, right? And, you know, someone said that to me in the book about the power of social prescribing, is that unlike the DSM, which, seeks to match you and your symptoms to a very specific disorder, it's less interested in the diagnosing what you have, because it acknowledges that people's situations and people's life events often produce a range of symptoms. And at what point it stops being useful at a point when you say this person has depression, anxiety, loneliness, chronic pain, ADHD, like, let's just say this person's not well.
Right.
And understandably so, they're having a reaction to an environment that they were not evolved to be well in. Let's tackle that root cause instead of trying to be so precise about the symptoms and type.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because these social prescriptions, they do work in a general way. They're generally health enhancing.
Yeah.
And it's, I would bet most people underestimate how wide reaching the benefits are of any of these social prescriptions.
Yeah.
So okay, love all of this. And there's part of me that's almost reluctantly going to kind of concede to the pressure to keep moving forward, because I think we could dwell on all of this.
Chapter 1, geez.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So as much as more as there is to say, let's move forward and let's talk about nature. Another social determinant of health, which for so many people, especially in the United States and many of the countries that you visited, it's not embedded into their life anymore. There has to be some effort to seek out nature. And so maybe we can kind of format this topic in the same way, where you can share one of the memorable stories of a person you encountered who was benefited by the social prescription of nature.
Definitely. Yeah. You're right in saying that, yes, a lot of us in a lot of countries live very disconnected from nature. And often, unlike movement, which is kind of like, ugh, I have to move. Like, I actually think people really like nature. There's some studies that show if you ask people to envision happiness or their happy place, it's like almost always some sort of natural landscape. And this, I think, plays into the fact that we have something called biophilia. We are sort of intrinsically have this love of nature. And some of that has to do with what you described, is that we actually evolved to spend time in nature. And it was evolutionarily adaptive for us to be able to pay attention to natural environments and notice little subtleties in it, like, which trees had food and which rivers had fish and that sort of thing. So with these nature prescriptions, I'll tell the story of Heather, because she's in the United States, and I imagine many of your listeners are too. Heather is someone who would say that her happy place is nature. But Heather also had a very, very busy lifestyle. She works 3 jobs. She is the primary caregiver for her grandmother. And she sort of said to me, even though being outside is my happy place, my life requires me to be inside. And fast forward, Heather ends up becoming very, very stressed by all of her many, many obligations she has, not just the 3 jobs she has to work, but all the emotional labor that comes with taking care of her family members. And she ends up having chest pains and insomnia from this. And so she goes to the doctor reporting these symptoms. And the doctor says very helpfully, I think you're stressed. And Heather says, well, yeah, of course I'm stressed. Look at my life. It's pretty stressful. And that got me thinking, well, yeah, how do you stop being stressed if your life is stressful? And that dovetails into all this research suggesting that what is stress? Stress is a demand on our attention, right? When there's actually a very cool nerdy origin story. We don't have to get into it, but it's when you feel like your life is sort of out of control, and there are all these external environmental pressures, putting pressure on you. It's actually a term in physics, stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so Heather experiences this, as do many people who are experiencing overwork or overwhelm or distraction. And again, I'll move quickly through this, but there was a lot of there was sort of an epidemic of stress in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in Japan, where the workforce changed very quickly, the economy grew, but people were working more hours, more stressful hours. They were working in cities, and they had no time to just chill. And right around then, the 1980s in Japan, the 1980s in the US, researchers sort of converged on this idea that the way we're living our lives is not natural. Like, we are not meant to live with this many demands on our attention. But they also became really curious about what could actually restore our attention as we face all of these demands on it. And lo and behold, they come to nature. These researchers in the 1980s, the Kaplans, actually, they're a husband and wife psychologist duo. They have this theory that says, most of these stressors, our work schedules, our new technology, our new communication, requires directed attention. But some environments, natural environments, can actually uniquely restore our attention. And this is because nature has a property they called soft fascination, which means it can capture our interest, it can capture our intrigue, it can capture our attention without taxing it.
Yeah.
Possibly because this is what we evolved to do. And so this is very relevant in the context of ADHD research, which we can get into, but just closing the loop on Heather, her doctor ultimately prescribes her a course in nature called Nature RX through a local nonprofit called Come Alive Outside, which is basically, 10 weeks of joyful outdoor activities with people. So hikes and walks and nature poetry and forest bathing, that sort of thing. And someone might hear that and they think, wait a minute, I thought you just told me that Heather's stressed. She doesn't have time for this. And that was what she said in the beginning, right? That she didn't have time to do what she really loved, which is to be outside. But what the research suggests is that actually spending time in nature, kind of like sleeping, is a really good investment of our time because it can improve our focus. It can improve our concentration. It can restore our attention, and it can make Heather more efficient in the time she does have if she's had some time to sort of have her attention restored through nature.
Yes. I think you explain what stress is in exactly the way that I've learned about it in all the stress textbooks that I've read and taught from. And I've come to think of it much like you just described, that stress really has everything to do with the relationship between demands and resources. Mm-hmm. One of those resources, of course, being attention, another being time, another being money, another being energy, another being social support. And whenever we have enough resources or a surplus of resources to meet the demands in our lives, we don't get distressed. We experience a good stress. We handle pressure well. But whenever those resources are depleted and the demands are still high, we get overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that those resources are finite, that they need to be replenished. Yeah. And what I take from your book and the research you present and everything else I've learned is that nature is one of the most effective replenishing activities.
Yep. I think you're totally right. Yeah, I love that idea of it. Yeah, replenishing resources. Like, no human could possibly, if you brought back like an ancient human and you put them just like in a typical day in the life today, like me, case in point, I have 2 phones right now. I have my laptop. I have my email that might beep. I hope it doesn't. I have, some people have house phones still. There was a car that just beeped outside. I live in New York. Like, no person could keep up with all of those distractions. Like, we just simply did not evolve with all those faculties. And it's why there's a lot of research. We like to ignore it because we think we're the exception of the rule that says, like, multitasking is impossible. No person, no matter how good they think they are at task switching and being able to handle all these distractions, we just simply can't, for all the reasons you say. We're limited. And nature in some ways is, one of the only things that can sort of like reset the dials. Yes. And I mean, we could talk about this if we get to talking about part 3, but for me, I think it taught me that I often feel like very stressed and overwhelmed and easily distracted. And like, I'm famous for having like 300 text messages at all times that I have not responded to. And I think after I spend time in nature, I'm more able to, I'm better at judging my stressors. Like, how much of this is just me being stressed about stress? Can I break this down into smaller parts? It really is a wonder drug.
Truly. Oh my goodness. And I love, you gave an example too. We don't have to go into it. I'll let people read the book, but about the man who went fishing. I think that was part of the nature chapter, right? Yeah. The man who joined a fishing group, and how restorative that was to his attention. And I was able to relate to that very strongly. I grew up, and my father is like a great fisherman. He loves fishing. He took my brothers and I fishing very often. He's now taking my children and his other grandkids fishing, and it is uniquely beneficial. I remember one person from that group that you were talking about described it as this, like, you have these kind of periods of concentration that are pretty frequently rewarded. They're kind of, it's almost just basic operant conditioning and like the schedule of reinforcements. It's unpredictable. And in psychology, we know that, interestingly, unpredictable, variable schedules of reinforcement actually are more reinforcing to certain behaviors. And fishing fits right into that because you never know when you're going to catch the fish. Yes. And so you're concentrated. And then at some point, eventually, but unpredictably, you're rewarded big time. It's very rewarding. So I just thought, and again, kind of like what we were saying with movement, there's so many ways to connect with nature. You can fish, you can hike, you can scuba dive, you can, whatever it looks like, personalize it. And I love too the link workers. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, starting to talk about the system of it all, but how often when these prescriptions are made, whoever's making the prescription will connect the patient, the client, with a link worker who gets to know the individual and attempts to personalize the social prescriptions. And I just think that is worth highlighting. That's super important.
Definitely. Yeah. Oh my gosh. The link workers are so key. And I'm happy to talk about that. But, one more thing with fishing, which, first of all, I love that you personally have been prescribed yourself this. Your dad is now prescribing your kids this. I also think there's something very important there about it being accessible for men. Like, I think a lot of times, even the name social prescription, if someone is naturally a little bit more introverted, the idea of like meeting new people, group activities scares them. Fishing is kind of great, which tends, I think, to happen more with men because, you have a shared goal in mind. You can be silent as you do it. Right. And it's this classic, like, manly, like, bonding shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. And
over a task. Yeah.
Yes, over a task. And it was so funny. I show up like this zany American girl, zipped up on cold brew, ready to catch my fish, trying to fish with them. And like, it takes a long time. And I'm asking them like, how do I make this go faster? What do I do? Do I shimmy it? And they're like, you just got to be patient. And fishing's a great hack for that. Like you said, it literally forces you to be patient, to, as you said, anticipate the unpredictable. And yeah, it's sort of forcing you to sit still in nature in ways that if we were, just saying, okay, I'm going to sit still in nature, we might, give up more easily. Like there's a goal, right?
Exactly. And there's a goal. Exactly.
Yeah.
When it comes to ADHD, which, is the American Psychiatric Association's framework for a collection of symptoms that can be categorized as basically inattentiveness and impulsivity. And so many people have been diagnosed with this, as you mentioned. And for so many of them, I have found it has become part of their self-concept. It's part of their identity, which is problematic, but maybe for another conversation. But anyway, I think part of the reason that there's such an incredible explosion of ADHD diagnoses is complex, but one of the reasons I think is the stakes for paying attention are not high enough. I think for many people, life has become quite comfortable and they're not faced with much danger. They're not encountering risks and they don't feel like they're doing very high stakes activities. And nature, of course, is where we find all the danger, right? Like that's another factor I think in this, is that especially if you do a dangerous activity, like you go hunting or you go rock climbing or hike a treacherous trail, the stakes for paying attention are very high. Now there's a serious consequence if you don't focus.
Yeah.
And I think many people would benefit tremendously from a high stakes situation where it's kind of like pay attention or get injured.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Let's prescribe some danger out here. I think you're so right. Also, speaking of nature, sorry, the sun is really out. I'm trying to like bob my head around
it. Right.
But yeah, you're so right. And, there's an interesting study in that chapter that talks about how kids, there was a study that demonstrated that kids who were diagnosed with ADHD, who were prescribed just 20 minutes in nature, had gained concentration capabilities with effects on par with taking Ritalin. Amazing. And so I think you're totally right that, and at least for kids, or at least it used to be the case, that like you are sort of more the natural course of, playing in the schoolyard, playing in the backyard, running around, getting dirty with your friends. Like, that was an opportunity to sort of like let kids be kids and experience danger and, have some fun with it, but as you say, figure out like hard things together. When you become an adult, though, those opportunities are so much fewer. And I'm sounding like a broken record, but I do think a lot of the nature prescriptions in particular are reintroducing that sort of childlike wonder and adventure that we know is so essential. Like when we look back on our lives, those memories will be the strong ones, but that there are so few opportunities to actually like pursue in our lives.
I don't think you're sounding like a broken record at all. I think I appreciate what you're emphasizing and bringing in. Well, again, I'm like aware of the time, aware that you have less than a half an hour before your next meeting and how there will be much left unsaid. Maybe a part 2 is in order. But let's, capitalize on the time we have left here.
Yeah.
And so the 3 prescriptions we haven't talked about are art, service, and belonging. But I also do want to spend a little time talking about healthcare systems and then also personal stuff. And so in our attempt to do that, maybe we can let people read up on art and service and contemplate it for themselves. Yeah. And maybe we can just touch on belonging, because I think there's some downright profound insight about how to really achieve an experience of belonging. And then we'll get into the other stuff. So just tell me this, like, what did you learn about the importance of belonging and what belonging actually is?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so definitely agreed. Spoiler, SparkNows version, art and service, very good. and belonging, like, is very good too. And there were some question marks, like, don't all of these social prescriptions involve belonging? And yes, they do. Like, in some ways, all of these social prescriptions, there's a little bit of overlap. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that for many people, especially many older people, like, there isn't an opportunity for them to just get themselves to a swim club or fishing or an art class. Like, a lot of people are homebound. And so I was curious about whether belonging was like an ingredient that we could just manufacture, even if a person cannot leave their home, And what I found is, yes, we can. And belonging I use to describe, often, probably predictably, like the opposite of loneliness. And it's almost cliche to say this, but we know that you could be lonely in a crowd. We know that it depends not on the quantity of your connections, but the quality. And so I was really curious about, like, okay, what does make a quality connection? What are the conditions we need in place to feel a sense of belonging, which, for the very same reasons we needed movement, nature, art, and service, we needed this too, to be able to survive. It was very evolutionary advantageous if you belonged with a group. The group protected you, you protected the group. And it turns out, like, the modern mechanics of belonging aren't so different from that. I was really interested in this research by psychologists Arthur and Elaine Aron, who some of your particular psychology savvy listeners might know. They had a pretty viral New York Times article summarizing their research. It's called The 36 Questions That Lead to Love. And that comes from their theory about what love or close connection or belonging is, which is an opportunity to expand who you are. So, making this come full circle, like, how do you cultivate that? It's you give people to self-expand. And they say that, again, this is something we evolved to do. We evolved to know who we are to the highest degree so we could maximize our unique skill set in our environment, right? Mm-hmm. Self-knowledge was a way to thrive in our environment. And the way we arrive at that is through other people who help to show us who we are. And the way we arrive at that is by asking these sort of deep digging personal questions. I think, first of all, there has to be a baseline that Arons also say, a feeling that you have things in common. And that could kind of start with common interests. Maybe then you go deeper to common life experiences. And then you sort of get into this business of, like, deep reflecting on what makes you you. And through close connections, we have the opportunity to do that. So... yeah, I that was a long-winded way.
That was beautiful. That was very beautiful.
Saying that, yeah, belonging is absolutely essential. And some research suggests that it's been described as, like, weak ties and close ties. We also need to feel like we belong sort of peripherally to groups. Like, I'm a New Yorker and my family's Ukrainian, whatever. But we also, beyond that, also really need to feel like we have close connections, people who help us understand who we are.
Yes, exactly. There's a good phrase too. It might even be the title of a paper. And the phrase is the strength of weak ties. No. And the idea that, that the peripheral circle, social network is important and does help fulfill the belonging need. But as you just pointed out, we also need those true companions. There was a person you were quoting talking about exactly what a companion was. You said the person said a companion should be someone on whom you can rely, to whom you can relate, and in whom you can confide.
Yeah.
And that, that sort of full package companion is a confidant that affirms who you are.
Yeah, that's it.
And that's it. And you used another great analogy of like, you can become more satiated eating a 200-calorie omelet than a 500-calorie bag of chips.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of speaking to what you said earlier, the importance of the quality of connections over quantity, and that it's true in the same way that 2,000 calories is not the same as 2,000 calories. Some are much more nutrient dense. Friendships and relationships are not all the same.
Yeah.
If they need to be kind of nutrient dense, they need to be high quality, they need to be genuine, authentic, affirming. And that's how there's such a thing, like people think a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's such a thing as more sufficiently meeting a need. It's not like checking the box or not. It's to what degree is this need met? And sometimes it's partially met, and that can lead people to think that the box is checked, but that's maybe worth reconsidering because it might need to be fortified.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I love that. And that box checking, thought experiment, I do think is really important because, I think when we talk about the loneliness epidemic, I think when we talk about how people have fewer close friends than they ever did, how we sort of have this great disconnection between us, it's easy to be like, well, just put people in a room and get them to start talking and all will be fine. Like it's not that simple. It's really about making sure that those people, whether it's one person or 10 people, can meet those needs that we have, right?
Yes.
It's not just, like checking a box. People check. It's like, does this person make me feel seen? Do I feel like I can trust them? Do I feel like when I go through the ups and downs of life, this is someone I'm going to want to confide in and ask for advice from? That's what really matters.
Exactly. Okay. Well, again, with so much left unsaid about the power of belonging, hopefully, again, we've kind of made it clear. And, again, hopefully no one's dismissing it as like, yeah, no, I get it. But really like absorbing this, letting it sink in, considering the evidence and contemplating the power of it. Well, okay. You tell me if you need to stop at any point and prepare for your next meeting, but if you still have time, I would love to start to get into, what was part 2 of your book, where you really looked at whether or not it's realistic to expect this to be adopted at a large scale by whole healthcare systems. And it's just a brilliant section of the book. It's just amazing how much effort you put into that, traveling to different countries of different sizes, with different levels of resources, different types of healthcare systems. You looked at Canada and the UK with universal healthcare. You looked at Singapore and South Korea, which are very different in terms of the resources available. And then you looked at the United States and, a country of pill prescribing, and asked the question, could social prescribing really be adopted realistically? And so I want to hear you speak to that, and maybe we'll zoom in on the United States in particular. And maybe to kick this off, I'll read something you wrote that I thought was just really good. So this is after you're reflecting on, the way in which profit incentivized pharmaceutical companies have kind of infiltrated and contaminated healthcare in the United States, and how, we're one of 2 countries where the pharmaceutical companies can advertise directly to us. It's just so embedded in our culture.
Yeah.
And so you're right. I realize what I'd tell skeptics of social prescribing in America.
Mm.
It's true that big
Yep.
pharma can do big bad things. There will always be shitheads like the Sackler family, which, if anyone's not aware, owns it's Purdue Pharma, right? That they own.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great Netflix series that people can watch to get a full understanding of why they're shitheads, because I fully endorse that description. And it's true that America, with its private healthcare, you say, its rampant inequality, culture of diagnose, treat, repeat, and quick fix seekers like me, you admit, has an uphill battle ahead to make social prescribing both available and desirable. But you go on to say, I realize too that the uphill battle hasn't stopped anyone. I realize there's another true story unfolding. For even though America has shithead Sacklers, it also has people who find their resources, time, energy, creativity, and compassion to treat social needs, even if it means breaking the rules. People who don't just imagine a future where doctors prescribe more than drugs, but who work through their lunch break to build it.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. And thanks for bringing out the shithead Sacklers. Funny story. When you write a book, you have to have like lawyers read it, and they're like, the Sacklers might sue you. And I'm like, bring it on. They are shitheads.
I respect that. I respect that.
But yeah, I think let's talk about the US, because I think that's really important for your listeners who might be like nodding their heads in agreement so far, as I think most people do. They understand the value social prescribing can bring, but it just seems so impossible in the US, right? And I think maybe let's start with, I know you've talked a lot on this podcast about depression and antidepressants and psychiatric medication. What I found really interesting in researching this chapter is that number one, as we said earlier, like the medications preceded the understanding of the disease in most instances. Number two, these medications were developed originally not to treat the original, ailment, depression, anxiety, whatever. But number three, and this is where I think it's relevant, like they all kind of came out around the same time, or rather they all became mass marketed around the same time. And this is the 1950s and 60s, at a time when, I talked to my parents about this. They were pretty little, but like everything just kind of stopped making sense around then. Like there was these fear of communists, and we were involved in all these world wars, and it was the beginning of sort of like the suburban sprawl, and really becoming like I think that was the beginning of the America that we know today. And it was also the beginning of the DSM, as you talk about, right? 1952 was the first DSM. So I thought that was really interesting, that all of these responses to symptoms of psychiatric distress happened at the same time, and that was at a time when the nation itself was kind of like going through a what the fuck moment. Yeah. And I say that like rather than treat like the root cause of it just seemed like modern life was stressful, and there was no way to possibly treat that. It just became easier to treat the resulting symptom. And it wasn't helped by the fact that, Hollywood really got behind psychiatric medication. Like Elvis, was popping Milltowns, the anti-anxiety drug du jour. And in other words, like I used to think, partially after watching like the Sackler documentary and things like reading Dope Sick, I used to think it was like a couple of bad actors that we could just oust, and like if we could disempower the bad actors in big pharma, then like things would be so much better. But it actually made me realize it's way more complicated than that. Like, this is just so deeply ingrained in the way that we've responded to the chaos and stress of modern life, and it's cultural within us too, right? Like, and I acknowledge this at the beginning of the chapter, like, I drink an ungodly amount of cold brew each day, even though I know I should be sleeping more. Like, I, sometimes eat those crappy protein bars, even though I know I should be taking the time to like cook myself a nice piece of protein. It's just, we've built our whole lives, I think, really beginning in the 1950s and 60s around this quick fix culture that it is going to take all of us to get around that. But there's hope, and we could talk about why there's hope if you want.
I do want to talk about that.
Sorry, that was a little bit more expanding on the problem.
No, it's good to highlight that, like, to really understand, because it's like, I think you even said in the book that it's true, the classic, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we're like the horses, we're being led to the water, but we are choosing to drink. And maybe you could also say that our heads are being shoved into the water by our culture in a sense. But we still ultimately have the power of whether or not to grab for these quick fixes. And so maybe understand the origins of why we have the mentality is very helpful. And I think you read that out well.
Yeah. Okay.
So please go on.
Well, good. Yeah. And I think it's that culture of quick fixes, and what I describe as sort of a mutually reinforcing domino effect. Like, modern life is stressful, we become stressed. Because like, our healthcare system actually can't handle the amount of distress and the degree to which people are distressed. They prescribe us a pill because that's the easiest thing. I don't subscribe to this theory that there's like an evil cabal of doctors that are just wanting us to like guzzle pills all day. Like, my friend Kate, who's a doctor on a pediatric ward, says that she saw a teenager who was severely distressed. She really wanted to get that person psychotherapy, but the wait time was 6 months. And what's her clinical guideline to do is, not to leave this person in distress and say, see you in 6 months, is to prescribe an antidepressant. So we have that pressure of health providers not being able to keep up with the demand. But I think we also have some health providers who, as you mentioned in that paragraph, like, really have gone against the grain of what their profession encourage, of what the culture encourages, to treat those social determinants. And so you have some that are actually, when I say social determinants, treating like the material, basic social determinants, like making sure people have food. If people don't have food, that's a huge source of stress and anxiety. Making sure people have adequate housing and legal support to protect that housing. There's a whole section on that. And I think you have a lot of individual doctors who are in their own practices prescribing movement and nature and art and service and belonging. One example I talk about that's pretty popular in the US is this program called Walk with a Doc. And it basically started by this cardiologist, Dr. David Sapir, who was frustrated by the amount of patients he were seeing with lifestyle-related diseases, and physical inactivity was a root cause. But kind of like Frank in the, cycling example, he didn't just say, you should be exercising more. And he really didn't feel comfortable prescribing all this high blood pressure medication, procedures and different sort of like cardiac pharmacological solutions. He said, I'll see you in the park Saturday, 10 a.m. Let's go for a walk. My wife will be there. Bring whoever you want. Like, let's start here. And sure enough, he says that to his patient. He starts saying that to a lot of his patients. And pretty soon, hundreds of patients are meeting him every Saturday for a walk. And then David starts spreading the template to other doctors around the country and the world, so much that today there are 500 Walk with a Doctor chapters. it would have been easy for him to just prescribe a pill or wag his finger and say exercise more, but he really cared about his patients. And I think a lot of doctors do. I think they just don't have the tools or the resources or the time to do this kind of care. But I also think that's changing because of all the stats we're seeing around the number of doctors who are not only burnt out, but there's a new term to describe them. They're morally injured, meaning that they know that the right thing to do would be to find some way to treat the root cause of their patient's suffering, but they don't have the tools or the resources or the time to do that. And that's causing people to leave the field, and that's causing the doctors to become depressed and anxious as well. So social prescribing, I'm looking at the time. I don't want to end this convo, but social prescribing, I think, is an antidote to that as well. It's not just about giving patients better care for the patient's sake, but also for the doctor's sake. Yeah.
Maybe in the final 60 seconds, you can answer this question.
Yeah.
Julia Hotz, how has this project of writing The Connection Cure changed your life?
Oh, dang, in 60 seconds? In every way possible. It's like I will never understand the world suffering or my friends suffering or my own suffering in the same way. Like, I know there's so much we didn't get into in this podcast. I really hope we can do a part 2, but I just feel that this is such a common sense solution to treat the root causes of our suffering, of our disconnections in our environments by reconnecting us to things that matter to us. And it's something, and this is really quickly summarizing part 3, but every single day I use these social prescriptions when I'm feeling sad or stuck about something, the symptoms of what could be depression in a more extreme scale. I get out and I move my body. When I'm feeling distracted and overwhelmed, I go out into nature. When I'm feeling anxious or really worried about something, we didn't get into this, but art is really powerful for that. So I will try to get lost in some kind of art or literature. When I'm feeling really grumpy and down and, angry, I try to turn to service, right? We didn't talk about this, but service is really powerful for, kind of reversing the effects of anger. And finally, when I'm feeling really lonely, which, again, I hope you read the book to see I don't mean lonely in the loner sense, but I'm just feeling like I need some of that quality broccoli-like connection. I feel that in learning about this, I have some of the tools to go and find it. Now that I know what belonging really is and what it can do for me, I'm more intentional about seeking it out. And I'm hopeful. That's the biggest thing. Let's be honest, we are in a strange time in America right now. There's a lot to be pessimistic about, but if folks go to socialprescribingusa.com or my own website, socialprescribing.co, you'll see examples of people really trying to fight to make this mainstream, even if it means going against the grain, even if it means a lot of resources spent and personal sacrifices made, because it truly is the future and is the right thing to do.
Amen.
What a great way to end.
Julia, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having me. I'm such a fan of you and everything this community has done. And I just feel that, these solutions are dedicated to you guys.
And thank you to the Psychology audience who listened to the whole conversation. So glad that it kept your attention and was meaningful.